Hey Josh, how's it going?
It's going great, Elliot. How are you?
I'm doing stupendous. Any better and you'd have to pinch me.
Oh, yeah? Tell me more.
Oh, it's just another wonderful day of being vertical, I think is the new measure for success around this household sometimes.
Better than being 6 feet under, I guess.
It certainly is that. Yeah. No, all things are good. So, the topic today, I think, is one near and dear to both of our hearts, is talking about you moving from full-time employment to retiring early.
The great
So,
transition.
yes, the great transition. And I think is a topic that really we know through our hundreds, if not thousands of hours of consumption of five media is probably one of the lesser known topics and less discussed topics, certainly. There's a wealth of information out there on accumulation and pinching pennies and how to even spend our money better, but not too much on the great transition into retirement. So with that, I'll kick it to you on maybe a little bit of a walkthrough to remind everybody on your story and how you came to be where you are today.
Yeah, thanks. I think that there's probably a subset of our community that is continuously marching towards financial independence and has the thought of early retirement on their mind at some place on the horizon, but they may not know what their life is going to look like whenever they reach that point. I've told this story before, but I remember there was a guy in our local group who asked a question one time to the presenter on one of our case studies. And he said something like, I'm a couple years out and I have no idea what my life is going to look like on the other side. And I mean, it came from a point of like fear or concern. Like you could definitely tell in his voice, like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And it just really struck me as I was it was hard to believe that somebody would be that far along and really not know what their life was going to look like. And of course, you hear sometimes people that are pushing back on the fire community saying, well, what do you do? You must be bored. You don't have enough to occupy your time, and just from different remarks like that. So I think for me, just to kind of go back in time, I was in a career that I just kind of ended up in. It took me like 8 years or so to get through college because I was going part time, and finished once I was working for a company that was paying me tuition reimbursement. And I was never really too interested in the products that they produced or the jobs that I had. It was just a means to an end. I needed to make money, and this company was was a decent company. In fact, it was kind of digress just for a second, is that I never even knew the company at all until I applied for a job there. I had no idea what they did or who they were. I've never heard of them before. The only reason why I applied was because I had been working at a grocery store, and there was a guy who also worked at the grocery store for a very brief period. He was a little bit older. He worked for another company, and he had gotten laid off, and he came and worked for the grocery store for a while, and while he was looking for his next full-time gig. And he came back and said at one point, he said, yeah, I'm working for this company. And I was like, I've never even heard of them. And another one of my friends was there at the time, and he said, oh yeah, my parents used to work there. And he said, we should go apply. And that's kind of how it came to be. I was looking for full-time stable income with benefits, and I ended up working there for 25 years. So all along, never really was all that interested in what the company did. And I always had looked for other ways to, I guess, enjoy life, so to speak, because work wasn't my life. Work was just work.
Yeah. And I think how important that is and how maybe countercultural that is in the United States, right? Is how many people maybe say that they work to live, but in reality, what their actions show time and time again is really that they're living to work. And I will certainly say that there It's funny. I think that's the first time that I've ever heard that story in totality of how you landed at your employer. I remember when I was in college and we had these career fairs, and a bunch of different employers would be at these career fairs, and they would, so being a studious person, I always tried to go hit the ones that, especially, I was keen on trying to get a job at. But also, I graduated in December of 2009, so at the tail end of the Great Recession. And in some ways, like, it wasn't that jobs were just flying off the shelves like they had been previously. And so I do remember times where I walked up to a booth, and a recruiter would ask me, "Oh, like, hey, what do you know about the company?" You're like, I know nothing about you guys. Like, and now, the benefit of hindsight and experience, if I was working as a recruiter, or even just, somebody from the company, and a potential recruit came up and said that to me, that resume is going in the trash. Like, almost, like, good, bad, or indifferent. I know that's how the game is played, but it's funny how different times have changed. But I mean, ultimately, I think the approach of which you've outlined is what so many people share. Is ultimately, I don't care what the product is at the end of the day. I Work is a means to an end, and that's how I've viewed my career as well.
Yeah, that's certainly how I did. It was always just, this is what I need to do to have health insurance for my family, to be able to provide, put food on the table, just be the provider. That's how I viewed it. And it never was like, hey, I want to climb the ladder or anything like that, even though that did happen often while I wasn't necessarily trying. It's just opportunities presented themselves. And it was a good company to work for. Definitely don't want to disparage the company itself. It just wasn't a good fit for me. However, I was the kind of person that I just stuck with it. And it got to be to a point where I got into a role and then into a department that I excelled in. And it almost got too easy, that I could just essentially be on cruise control. And I think somewhere along the line, I don't know when the light bulb went off exactly, but I remember that there was a couple of points where I started to notice I don't necessarily need to do all the things and be that person that's just like out there in front of everybody. You know the kind of person I'm talking about, that always just wants to make sure that their voice is heard and always wants to volunteer for everything. I found that if I just spoke to my boss and said, "What's most important to you?" I would make that my priority. So like now, this time of year is typically review and or objective setting season for most corporations, most large corporations. And you're looking at the year ahead and trying to say, here's what our goals are. And if you're lucky, you have a boss that can clearly tell you, this is what we want to accomplish this year. And if you use that as your roadmap and just play defense on like everything else, especially if you're a knowledge worker like you and I were, you can kind of just pick and choose what you want to focus on. So I learned that kind of early on. And then to tie it back into like the transition piece, is that I would focus my efforts there and then try to get as efficient as possible at whatever that thing was, or even just try to complete it as quickly as possible, and then have a lot of free time available. That might be a little bit, that might be a little bit, I mean, I'm far enough removed now. I'm 10 months removed. I can honestly say there was a lot of times I wasn't putting in 40 hours a week. I can't say that that's the norm for everyone and every organization.
How dare you, Josh?
But there were people that were working greater than 40 hours a week and not getting the results or not moving the needle. And I always saw that as a, that was a a failure on their part, so to speak, is that they were putting in way too much time and energy and effort and stress and all the negative things into their day to day and working, long hours and working at home when they got home in the evening and all of those things. While I figured out a way, I was like, kind of crack the code. I'm not going to do all this busy work. I'm going to try to push back on the busy work and just focus on the really important things and try to do as good as I can with that. And sometimes that made it feel like I was working part time.
I know that feeling. Is I have certainly had roles in the past where I certainly didn't work 40 hours a week. And yeah, I mean, I think that cuts both ways. It can be a blessing, can be a curse, but also I think you've said something really insightful is honing in on what are your expectations and what's most important, and kind of ignoring everything else, putting on horse blinders, saying, I'm going to focus solely on this. Everything else is noise. Get out of my way. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to meet this objective, and everything else, like you said, play defense. Just make sure that nothing calamitous happens. And trust me, you're heads above your peers in almost all scenarios. And I think your assessment of, let's say, that busybody that puts in those hard hours, or wants to, I, I certainly have been this person too that has, the come off mute at the end of a Zoom meeting to say thanks, and that's my contribution to the meeting. It's like, yeah, what a joke that is. But ultimately, if you are busy but you're not constructive with your time, then what are you doing? And I think there's a lot of value in knowing, are you actually being busy or are you being effective? And what you're kind of pinpointing.
I had a lot of those Zoom meetings, or we had Microsoft Teams, and I would always use them as an opportunity to ask myself and sometimes other people, do I have to be here? Do I need to be here? In what way am I going to contribute? If I didn't get a clear answer, I declined. I would do that. I would ask ahead of time. When I saw something get added to my calendar, I was, especially as I got closer and closer, I got a lot more courage. But I would say within the last 4 to 5 years, I played a lot of defense with my time. And a lot of this I probably learned from listening to Cal Newport and reading his books and how he manages his time. And so I took a lot of that back to my job. And I also, as a manager, I encouraged people to do the same, because I felt like a lot of the stuff was busy work and non-value added. And it took away from your attention to be able to focus on like job function number one, whatever that thing was that I or my boss's boss said is the most important couple of things that we need to focus on this year to be able to move the needle. If you're just sitting around, half of your department is all in this meeting to discuss this thing about this issue with something for a customer, why can't there just be one representative? Why do 5 people need to be on that call to hear the same message, while most of them are probably flipping through their phone and not even really paying attention to the conversation anyway?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, between that, like, this could have been an email kind of meetings, the old fateful meeting without an agenda. I think the mantra at one of my companies that I worked for was no agenda, no attenda. So that's cool to hear that you had the willingness to push back and say no, especially that far out. I think in a lot of ways people view that as a strength within your work, is, hey, like, Josh really knows where his value add is and where it's not, and like, this frivolous meeting is not adding to my efficiency, and it's not a value add. Like, I'm going to guard my time, and people are going to view that as a pro for having that level of understanding, and generally you get promoted even more, probably the more that you say no. So I still struggle to say no to a lot of things, so maybe I'll have to take a chip off the old block, Josh.
I can attest to the point about getting promoted more because, like I said, I started playing that kind of coverage, that defense, and looking at the most important thing, prioritizing that, and trying to become as efficient as I possibly could with that thing, and then really reducing my overall time. I started that probably around 2020 or so, maybe even a little bit before then. And then I got promoted twice in back to back years towards the end of my career there. And neither of them were, I did not seek them. I did not apply for them. I did not choose them. They were like, hey, do you want to take on more responsibility? We're going to give you this extra money. And I'm like,
You want some more
sure.
money, Josh?
And I will tell you on for one of them, the first one, I was at a point, Elliot, I'm not kidding here. So kind of again, trying to tie this back into our main topic of transition was that I was at a point where my job was getting to be so easy that I felt like I wasn't even needed anymore. Like I had direct reports, they were all doing great. The productivity level, the things that we needed to accomplish were getting done, and it was essentially on cruise control to the point where, and I'm not afraid to say it, I was doing some of my side stuff during the workday where we've talked about, I have a handful of rental properties. There were occasions where I would be meeting up with handyman or a contractor, or even sometimes, for the second half of the day, I'm taking my laptop with me. It's set up over in the corner here in case somebody needs to ping me, and I'm painting a wall or whatever needs to be done. I also was building furniture. I remember setting up my laptop in the garage. I'm out there doing my woodworking stuff. The laptop's over there. If somebody needs to call me or ping me, I can easily answer it and run inside and look like I'm sitting at my home office. I'm
There
not
you go.
necessarily I'm not necessarily advocating for this. I'm just saying I was able to get it to work for me because I think I had at least enough of a I guess there was enough confidence in me that I was able to get the work done, and my teams were doing the same.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, what so many companies really aspire to be is really a meritocracy, right? Is you should be measured upon the work that you are outputting. And so when I've had people that have reported to me, I don't care if you work 2 hours or 200 hours. If you're getting your task done that I assign you and like do not care like how you are spending your time, that is up to you. Like I measure it in output. I know that I've been in situations where that list can also be never ending. And so, hey, if you get one done super fast, then another one's right behind it. Well, that presents its own problem. But yeah, you know, it is it's important to understand how you are evaluated and measured. But anyway, all of this was quite a diatribe away from, I think, where we were intending this conversation to go. But if you want to excel at your full time employment, I think we've given you a couple of nuggets in the last few minutes here.
I will comment on your last point real quick and then we can move on. So you mentioned like if there's this long list and you're just knocking them off quickly. So that's where you have to manage the expectation of the deadline. And this is another thing that I learned early on is like get a deadline, get a finish date. What is my expected? When do I need to turn this in or have this complete or whatever? And two things, you can map it out so that you're working on it a little bit at a time over a period of time up to that deadline. So it's like project managing it. Or if you if you can really excel at something that maybe there's a thought that it's going to take you significantly longer, knock it out and then hold on to it. Keep it in your back pocket for the next 2 weeks until it's time to turn it in. Then you're on cruise control. And I think that there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I finished this. Here it is. And then it's like, okay, great. Thanks. Here's the other one. Then you're just asking to be, burn yourself out.
Married. Yeah, guilty. Through all these years, sometimes, yeah, you don't learn those concepts. But I digress. We want to talk more about your transition from full-time employment to retiring early. So remind me, or remind the audience, how long in advance did you give your employer notice of this eventual transition?
Yeah, I was a weirdo outlier. I gave 14 months. And part of that was because I got a brand new boss and I knew him from the organization and I wanted to just set the expectation and be transparent with him. I knew him well enough that he wasn't going to hold it against me in any way. And I wanted to just give him that courtesy. So the first time I met with him in person, I told him. And he at first was like thinking that it was going to be in 2 months because guess I mentioned the month, April. And I'm like, no, 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 next April. He's like, oh, okay. Kind of with a look of like, why are you telling me this right now? But yeah, I gave a bit of a caveat saying if things go completely sideways, I would love to remain employed, but that's the date that I'm hanging my hat on, and I don't anticipate bringing it in any sooner than that. And I think it was well received, and it went a long way to like just I guess the trust factor between him and I.
Given, I mean, obviously you talked through some of these factors, but was there any trepidation in yourself in telling this new manager, like, hey, I'm going to leave in 14 months, that they turn around and say, nah, I think you're actually going to leave today or next week when we've trained up your replacement or whatever it is? Were you concerned that the company was going to take their own action to try and remediate this quote unquote problem that they were going to face?
Honestly, it never crossed my mind. And part of the reason why was because of what I talked about leading up to. I felt like I was looked upon as a valued contributor and I was trustworthy. I had a pretty decent sized team at that point. Even aside from the actual team or just being a manager, I had somewhat of a skill set that was not something that is was quickly replaceable or easily the experience wasn't going to be easily obtained by either somebody new or even potentially somebody in the organization. Not to say that that hasn't happened by now, and somebody's probably come in and excelled beyond me. But I kind of knew the situation at the time was that some reorganizations had taken place, and I was one of the last remaining people who kind of had a feel for what was going on with some of the responsibilities that I had control of, and we had some new software that had just been introduced that people were still struggling with, so they were continuing to look at me as like another resource to be able to troubleshoot and navigate through some of that because it was really important that we get our product to our customer, and there was challenges with that. So I felt like had the upper hand, so to speak, in that situation. So it never even crossed my mind. I never even expected that there would be some type of like, hey, we're gonna let you go right now if you're planning to leave. They were more than appreciative that I gave that notice, and yeah, they definitely did not look at it as an opportunity to reduce headcount or anything like that.
Sure. Yeah. And, only, I guess one of the reasons that I bring this up is unfortunately I had kind of the inverse situation happen. And it wasn't because I think any ill will or anything like that. It was the fact that I was in a sensitive role. I was the head of cybersecurity for the firm that I was working for at the time. And I had access to passwords, if they got into the wrong hands or was a big deal. And So given that fact, I was essentially shown the door the following day of giving my notice. Now, granted, I got paid out for the entire notice that I was going to give, which was a month. So, hey, call it a company paid mini retirement. You know, there are worse things in this world. So, but yeah, understanding, I think, in my own mind, having gone through an event like that in the past, and that was a company that I had worked for nearly 10 years, that, as I marched through my own steps towards early retirement, that has me a little gun shy of giving the company the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, it's certainly going to look different for everybody, and every employer is going to probably look at that and hold it with a different type of weighting system, whether it be, you're an individual contributor or and I think I did it, to kind of back up just for a moment. I think I did it partly out of a selfish reason for me being able to say, if I put this out there, I'm going to stick to it, because it was a way for me to avoid the one more year syndrome, or just continuing to just kind of let the date float. I was pretty, I was very set on the date, because the date was going to be my 25th anniversary with the company. So it just happened that it was on a Friday, and like all the stars aligned, and I thought it was just a perfect spot to choose. It was after the bonus season and all those things. So I thought that that was going to be a perfect date for me. So by deciding on the date and then being able to share it, I knew that it was much, much more likely that I was going to stick to it and not just let it continue to float.
No, that's a fair point, because I think one of the questions that I was going to ask that I think you just answered very well is one of the biggest points or discussions that I think people have in this conversation of transitioning from full-time employment to early retirement is the concept of one more year syndrome, and how you stymie, like, how do you prevent falling victim or, prey to one more year syndrome of just saying, oh, hey, like, it's real easy not to change anything and continue to make more money, and say, oh, hey, maybe instead of that 4% rule, I need my 3.8% rule, and make any number of qualifications that are, we make all of these points to ourselves on why we can't do it right this second, even though we've been planning for this moment for years, if not decades in most cases. So I guess along with that, beyond just saying, yeah, hey, it met this nice arbitrary kismet date of 25 years, was there anything else that made it so you're not going to fall victim of one more year syndrome?
I think I probably did have a couple of years of one more year syndrome already, because Lori and I had talked about it a few different times, and she was encouraging me for years, like, just leave, we're fine, that we're fine. She was going to continue to work. And when I set out on this path, my initial plan was that we were both going to retire at the same time. And then somewhere along the line, she said, I don't really want to retire at the same time you do. I'd rather just wait a few more years, see how you like it, see how things are going. And I don't mind my career, so I'll just keep working. And probably at that point, I probably could have pulled the trigger, but I waited a couple more years. And there was a couple of things, like wanting to make sure that our youngest got through high school. We wanted to get our house paid off. And there was just a couple of other little, like, milestones that we wanted to reach.
It's essentially, how did you reverse engineer that date? And I think you've answered it in a way that's very honest, is to say, I think I did have that one more year syndrome, probably a couple of years, and you've got backups for your backups, right? I think that's what people like to talk about in the FI community, is we have all of these conservative estimates that are, we layer these on top of each other. And when you view them in concert, it's like, okay, well, instead of the 4% rule. Maybe I do say I would really be more happy with 3.75. Well, hey, okay, that's fine. But then I also have rental real estate, but I don't want to consider that because I might have vacancies. And so now I won't consider that income. And oh, like everybody knows Social Security's going away. Like we're not going to have Social Security. So I don't want to count that either. Right. And that's how we build these layers really. I was listening to our good buddy Doug on Mile High Fi the other day. He had Evan Sebesta on the podcast, and I think I've had one conversation with Kevin ever, but I know one of the acronyms that he uses is that your money goes to the hogs, and it's H is for errors, O is for organizations, G is for government, and I don't remember if S is just plural, right? But saying that all these layers of conservatism that we put on our numbers just ultimately shows we're going to not be able to spend the amount of money that we ultimately have. And so if you're not careful, it's going to go to those heirs, your organizations, and the government. And so I know that I've talked about this on the podcast. Is I'm trying to be very conscious of this while not cutting too far the other way, right? We've had a few big names in the community say, jump off with the 1 year less syndrome. But at the same time, I don't want to be eating cat food at the end of my life because I I have planned poorly, so to speak. But is there any guidance that you can give me now being on the other side that says, hey, looking back at the decisions that I've made, hey, I did live 1 more year syndrome maybe a couple times over. If I could go back with the benefit of hindsight, would I do it the same way? How would, put yourself in my shoes now? How would I do it differently?
Yeah, so I think about it from two aspects. One would be the money side of things. And I think that you're probably potentially further along with that kind of framework than even I am. I mean, before we hit record today, you were talking about, okay, here's where I am. And if it's 4% this, if 5% that, and I don't even really look at that anymore. And part of that is because my wife still works. I want to be very transparent and clear with that. But even if that weren't the case, I know that we would be fine. As we looked at our spending in one of our recent episodes, we were far below where I even thought we were going to be for 2025. So I'm not so worried about that. I think you have that dialed in, and most people do. The other part of it is time and what you're going to do with your life. And for me, that was what I really focused on, maybe even to a degree that I didn't focus enough on the math on the expenses and the financial side of things. I was more worried about how am I going to spend my time. I remember having a bit of like a existential crisis in the last couple of months leading up to my final date, where I sat down with Lori after I've been kind of stressing over this for a week or so. And I'm like, what if I run out of things to do? Like I literally had that fear as a guy who I actually outlined like a dozen interests and hobbies that I have, and more tend to come my way on a monthly basis or regular basis, that I just simply can't do it all. But I really thought that was going to be the case. So we've talked in previous episodes how I made those lists, and kind of going back to my story of how I was able to start working quote unquote part-time as I was introducing a lot of those hobbies, and I was starting to try to feel out like, is this something that I really want to spend time doing? Is this how I think I'm going to spend my time? And I would start mapping that out. And then like our friend Carl, Mr. 1500 says, what do your weekends look like? And then is that going to be And I would take that one step further and ask, is that something that the things that you do on the weekend, is that going to be something that is scalable and sustainable? Meaning, if you're spending, let's say, all of your time on the weekends with kids, just as an example, is that something that you want to scale? Do you want to spend more time with your, like, do you really want to spend more time with your kids, like every day, all day, or when they're available, whatever? Or do you want to have more time for yourself? Or are they at an age where they want to spend time with you right now, but they're maybe not that far off from not spending as much time with you? So if you think that you're going to be going into retirement, and this isn't necessarily for you, Elliot, but for anybody, if you're going into that with whatever that thing is that you think you're going to be doing, you really have to start asking yourself maybe some of those tough questions. Is that really where I'm going to be spending my time? And then if you go with the idea that this is what I'm going to, how I'm going to be spending my time, these are the things that I'm passionate about, interested in, can you expand on that? Is there opportunity for that to continue to grow so that you have enough to keep you busy, that you're not, and busy is a bad word, but enough to fulfill you so that you're not getting to a point where you're bored and maybe feel like you've made a mistake. And I feel like I tested a lot of that in the final couple of years, still had a little bit of doubt in the final couple months, but that really helped me transition, because I wasn't just drop the 8 to 10 hours a day, quote unquote, 8 hours a day that I was working, and had to find, what was it going to be that was going to occupy my time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is insightful to think about, and we've talked about this on multiple episodes, right? Is what does your perfect day look like? Moving more of those things that are in your perfect day into a normal day, and testing it out, right? Is I think that's what everybody should do as they get closer to that, pulling that proverbial ripcord and saying, "Yeah, I'm ready for retirement. Time to go execute the plan." Right? You better have tested it and at least tried it out, and to see, does this actually fit or not. And not to say that just because you try something and you don't like it, like that's a failure. If anything, I think that's the opposite of a failure. It's showing you one more thing that you know that you don't like, and that's just giving you an opportunity to further refine and try things out and figure out, yeah, hey, what do I actually like to do? How do I like to spend my time? Who do I like to spend it with? And and like you said, I don't think I know anybody who is retired that just is unhappy with what their life looks like on the other side, because ultimately you're responsible for it, right? And if you're unhappy, you're going to make changes to make it what you want it to be, and especially in this community more than anything else. And like you said, we've talked about this on multiple episodes, is I think it's almost uncanny how society wants us to fit into the bucket of, hey, you work, you're a somebody in their 40s, you need to work for another 15-20 years, right? And so here's some more work that I need to give you, because that's what you do. That's what we all do. And so Josh is busy. He has lots, or Josh isn't busy because being retired means you're not busy, right? I mean, that's clearly what everybody has in their mind, is that you're just sitting there doing nothing. And so I clearly need to project what my feelings of, hey, this person isn't busy, therefore I need to go give them tasks to do, because that gives them meaning in their life. Heaven forbid they make their own decisions upon how they spend their time.
Yeah, I still have friends that will ask me, like, what do you do? And they ask with like almost like I don't know, a sarcastic connotation or emphasis tone to their voice. And I'll start to answer, but then I'm like, well, some of these things, you kind of like choose what you're going to tell a certain audience. So some people, it might just be easy enough that I say, I work on my rental properties. And I actually, oh, quick side note here, but I'll tie it into the conversation is that going back to our accountability stuff for our health, Elliot, I had on my list that I was supposed to get a new doctor and get a physical, schedule my colonoscopy, and I have done all of those things. So I met with my new doctor and I just went and gave my blood for the blood work today. And a colonoscopy is supposed to get scheduled through they're supposed to call me and get that scheduled. They said that's probably going to be several months out. But I was reminded of that because my doctor asked, what do you do? And I said, oh, I actually took an opportunity, which is tough for me, as I said, I'm retired. And he's a younger guy. He's younger than me. And he like looked up from his tablet or whatever he was working on and was like in shock and like looked back like at probably looking at my birth date. He's like, really? What did you do? And I was like, well, I worked for 25 years for this organization, saved a bunch of money and left. And he was dumbfounded. And he's like, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I have some rental properties and I work on those. I was like, well, I'm not going to tell him I have a podcast and do YouTube videos and tinker around my house and ride my bike and stuff like that. I just wanted to, I guess, come across as somewhat productive.
Productive. Yeah.
He's like, oh, that probably keeps you busy. That's like having a full-time job. And I'm like, no, not really.
Yeah.
So it's just,
well, here, I was going to say, here, I thought you were going to tell me that I was the one that you've got friends that are asking you to fix their brakes. And yeah, I mean, of course, like that's the thing is how many times, like you said, I mean, you perfectly put it is how do I cater what I actually want to say to this audience? Because I feel, I mean, I think a lot of us in this community feel like we can't be our authentic selves to somebody else because they're not going to understand, right? Is like not, I know your answer to this doctor was clearly authentic, but in some ways, I'll call you out on it, right? Is because everybody can kind of wrap their mind around, oh, rental real estate. So that's a second job. Like, okay, so you had two jobs before, now you just have one. Like, it's an easy answer, as opposed to that other answer of saying, well, like I went for a hike today, or I do some YouTube videos, or I recorded a podcast today. It's like I and it kind of reminds me back to this was just a random memory that I had is one of my fraternity brothers used to on occasion drive me home from college. We would just share rides, whatever. And his dad was a pastor and he said, what's up, Elliot? How are you? And, fine. Like doing fine. Like whatever. The typical salutation, the most non-answer answer that we all give to anybody that asks that question, because in reality, most of the time when people are asking that question, they don't really care. I mean, we're making small talk. And he kind of called me out on it. And he was like, no, seriously, like, how are you? Like, what's new in your life? And it's like, yeah, that's what I think the FI community feels like to other people in the FI community is finally I can approach somebody and have a real conversation and not feel like I'm just putting on a mask to say I'm presentable to the rest of society, right? Because I'm not this contrarian person or this person with this contrarian view about work, which is so central to the culture in the United States.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I guess I maybe hadn't thought about it like that. And that when I find that I'm getting asked that question more frequently here lately, or at least people, even if they know, maybe they're asking me again, like, what do you do? How do you spend your time? And I still struggle with answering that, but you don't get people in the FI community asking you that question. They don't ask you, what do you do? How do you spend your time? It's, we start talking about the things that we're interested in, and so I need to be better at figuring out how to answer that question. And maybe I say something along those lines. Well, yesterday I went for a hike and then I took a nap and then I had a really great lunch and I worked on this project and I edited this video or this podcast or whatever. And that's more authentic than me trying to answer it in a way that I think is going to maybe make a little bit more sense or sit better with the person who's asking that question.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is a reason why things like economy or campfire have been as wildly popular, really, as they have been, is because it puts other people that want to have those deeper level conversations like all together, and you're able to have it near instantly. And like that's so weird because you just don't get that in our day-to-day lives in most cases, unless you've gone out and sought out like this community in like a local Choose FI chapter or something like that, where you have kind of those friends. And I will say, like, the people that I think I talk to most regularly now are people within the FI community. And I think like, certainly you know this, and you're one of these people, is because by the time I work in an office, I go in very early in the day to avoid traffic, and I leave about midday because I don't want to fight traffic on my way home. Really, because I have the belief that what's most important to me at this time of my life is time with my kids. And so I like to be home so that I can walk my daughter, home from school. I think that's, to me, that's a very important thing that I'm doing right now. And so, but when I'm coming home, I have a 35, 40-minute commute where I'm just like, man, I can sit here and I can listen to another FI podcast, or I can listen to some music, or I can call Josh and see like what's Josh up to today. And I know, or my buddy Alan, what's he doing today? Douglas, he's in an opposite part of the world, or the country. What's he got going on? And so much of, I think as we get older, it's harder to maintain friendships and things of that nature because our lives get more complex. We have families, we have jobs that are at different times, like people prioritize different things, we grow apart, whatever. But this community has a way of kind of cutting through that, is because once again, all of a sudden you have availability, and so much of creating a friendship is just being available and having, a connection with somebody. So I don't know.
Now it sounds
Random
like you're,
diatribe, but
yeah, it sounds like you're contradicting some of the points that we may have made a couple weeks ago in our most popular episode ever of now it's time to leave the fire community.
yeah. Well, I get Brandon's points, right? Is and I found myself actually thinking on that exact topic last night, is how much of my time, and I'll allude to a couple of different things here, right? I've talked about how I haven't coded this way, but I'm going to say it here and you can cut it out if you want to. But this has kind of been the year of the F the billionaire status for Elliot. Has been, my family has cut out Amazon. I am no longer on any social medias except for, regrettably, LinkedIn. And honestly, that is short for this world as well. I'll call it out now. So I'm no longer on Facebook. The only social media I'm on is the newly branded Choose FI forums, whatever. really just so that I know when choose FI St. Louis local events are happening. I mean, overall, and I think we might have a short topic on this about why I'm doing what I'm choosing to do and how that experiment has been working out. But I mean, I think that overall, just this connection and community is what allows us to be what Brandon was saying. And I really do agree about is if you get so ingrained into just consumption of FI media, and I get that this is so contradictory as I'm talking on a FI podcast, right? And I am a spreadsheet nerd to the end of time. I am literally staring at my annual spreadsheet pulled up right now, not by anything but coincidence. But what Brandon's core point was is like money is just a tool. And everything that we are doing is to allow you to go live your life. And your life isn't about making money. Money is just a tool that's going to allow you to go do the things that you actually care about. So you shouldn't be so interested in a number in a spreadsheet, or whether it's the 4% number, the 3.8, the 5%, and having debates about this. It's immaterial and it's a waste of time, quite frankly. Is how can you go about living your best life, and instead of optimizing for money, let's start optimizing for happiness and figuring out how are you going to do that.
Well said.
It only took about 5 times to finally get there, but yes.
I'll kind of wrap it up here as we're probably coming up on an hour. A couple of thoughts that I have going back to the topic of transitioning is that if there's anyone out there, if anyone's made it this far along and is still listening and they're thinking to themselves, boy, I don't know what I'm going to do when I have all this time available to me. One way to look at it is, how do you spend your free time? And then see if you can, like I mentioned earlier, scale that, and is it sustainable? The other would be, you mentioned something about social media. Look at that just for a reference. What do you like? What lights you up? What are you interested in? All these algorithms are keying in on what is likely going to be the most attention grabbing for you. So in my case, I only use YouTube. That's like the only thing that I consume. And the algorithm will serve me woodworking videos, car videos, just a lot of DIY content, house renovations, and things of that nature. And so that is continuing to tell me that's like something that I'm interested in. So that's where I spend my time. The other point that I wanted to make is, if anyone is saying, well, I think I'm going to be bored, or I don't know if I have enough to fill my time, and they're concerned about that transition, what I would say is that's probably just a script that you're telling yourself. And you need to like flip that script and say, I'm going to have so much time to be able to explore all kinds of things that I don't even know that I might be interested in today. And I think you've mentioned that in the past, where you're like, okay, well, I'm nearing the end here. I don't necessarily know how I'm going to be spending all of my time, but I'm going to figure it out. You're not in a position where you're like, I'm scared I'm going to be bored, because you start telling yourself that enough, you're probably going to be bored, and you're going to be one of those people that is starting to look for a job because you can't occupy your time otherwise.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're exactly right. Is how much of that self-talk, I mean, is really whatever you believe is true, right? And that is what's going to come out, is whatever you say, you're going to will it into existence. And so if you always are saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to do when I retire, you're probably right. You're probably, if you think all you're going to do is sit around and watch Netflix all day and that's going to bore you, you're probably right. But if you view it as an exercise instead of thinking about what you are going to do, maybe think about, okay, if money were of no issue today, what would you do today? Don't think about how you have to spend your whole week. How would you spend the next hour of your day? How would you spend the next morning of your day? How would you spend the afternoon? How would you spend your evening? Like, start to reverse engineer that. And the same way that we talked about in the reverse obituary is kind of, it's exactly true here as well. Like, you can do, think of the end in mind. What do you want your life to look like? And reverse engineer it. Or you can say, hey, I don't know, but I'm going to go try and find my next passion. Like, I've always said that I want to learn to be a cook. Well, go try and cook for an hour. Go, maybe you find out that you hate it. You love to eat, but you hate to cook. Okay, at least you've scratched a new thing off your list of saying, hey, I thought this was going to light me up. It does not. Great. You've learned something new. And you should always be happy when you've learned something new every single day. I think if you do that day in, day out, you will live a very happy life.
Good point there, Elliot. That's probably a good place for us to wrap it up.
Yes. Anyway, if you've stuck with us this far, thank you so much for following our meandering diatribes and our musings. But click the like, subscribe on the podcast player that you're listening to us on, or if you're one of the YouTubers, hopefully our smiling faces have at least amused you a little bit to give us a thumbs up today. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.